But before we get started, I'll just say a couple things. And I've said this before for those of you who've been on other tours. Just watch where you walk, because the ground is very uneven and a lot of the headstones are very low, and so it's very easy to trip if you're not watching your step. So please be careful as we're walking around. And I'm going to, this tour is on the veterans who are buried in this cemetery, and I'll be talking about a few others also who are from McFarland but aren't buried in this particular cemetery. And I'm going to go in chronological order, starting with the Civil War and then going on up through the Afghanistan war. All right, well, we'll get started. And I want to thank everyone for being here and your interest in the walking tours. This is our last one of the season, and this one is on the veterans of McFarland. And I'd like to thank Sarah and the E.D. Locke Public Library for assisting in putting these walking tours together. I really appreciate the logistics that you take care of and your assistance in this. And thank Ben and his crew for filming the walking tours. You can see all the walking tours that we did this summer on McFarland's YouTube channel. So that's something you can check. The first two are online, and the next one will be on very shortly. And the veterans tour that you'll see today will be on eventually sometime this fall.
Ron did all the work.
But in the two cemeteries in McFarland, there are about 140 to 150 veterans buried here. And a lot of them served in wars or in battles for our country. About over half of them served in wars from the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, and Vietnam, and one in the Afghanistan conflict. And so what we're going to hear today are stories of courage, of heroism, and sacrifice, and also heartbreak. And the first person we're going to talk about is Andrew Peterson, who's buried right here. He was born in 1845 in Vigdal, Norway, which is on the Sognefjord. And he came to the United States when he was 15 years old, arriving here in around 1860, and just a year before the Civil War broke out. And but in 1864, he joined the Wisconsin 15th Infantry. And that's quite significant because the Wisconsin 15th is very historic in terms of Wisconsin Civil War history, because it's known as the Norwegian Regiment, or sometimes the Scandinavian Regiment, because there are a few Swedes and a few Danes thrown in, but mostly Norwegians. And in 1861, Colonel Hans Christian Hegg recruited the Norwegians or the Scandinavians to join this infantry. And you all know Colonel Hegg as the person on the Capitol Square, the large statue. He was from Norway, and so he spoke the language of all these recruits that he was getting to fight in the Civil War. And the joke is that when they would do roll call every morning, when they'd come to Ole Olsen, 20 men would raise their hand and say, "Here." But the 15th was involved in a lot of major battles, including Lookout Mountain outside of Chattanooga, Missionary Ridge, and Chickamauga in northwest Georgia. But those battles took place before Andrew Peterson joined in February of 1864. And in 1863, in September, Colonel Hegg was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, so Andrew Peterson never served under Colonel Hegg, but he joined the 15th when they were down in Georgia, in Tennessee, and he took part in the burning of Atlanta. And then Sherman's march to the sea in Georgia, where they ended up in Savannah. And the march through Georgia was the most destructive military campaign against the civilian population during the Civil War. And the Army listed Peterson as living in Madison, born in Norway, age 19. He was a farmer and unmarried. He had brown eyes, light hair, sandy complexion, and stood 5 feet 6.5 inches. And he enlisted for 3 years on February 1st or February 3rd, 1864. And he mustered in at Camp Randall as a private. And he survived the war, and he came back. And in 1873, he married Gertrude Vigdal. And that's interesting because Andrew Peterson came from Vigdal, Norway. But I'm guessing so did his wife, Gertrude, and she kept the name of her town. And her parents are actually buried here as well, Anna and Andrew Vigdal, next to Andrew Peterson. And then on the other side, it just says mother, and that is Gertrude, Andrew's wife, is buried over there. And they had 5 sons and 6 daughters, and a lot of them, or most of them, are buried in the upper cemetery. And in his obituary, it mentioned that Andrew Peterson was always a zealous member of the McFarland Lutheran Church. And we're going to go to another Civil War veteran. We'll take a little hike over here. All right. Well, if some of you were at the first walking tour when I talked about the early immigrants and settlers, and the first grave that we stopped at was this tall white one here of Ingebrigt and Helena Johnson, who came over in 1845 on a sailing ship. Took them 2 months to get from Norway to New York, and they had 6 children with them. And 3 of those children were sons who fought in the Civil War. Their oldest was John Johnson, and he enlisted in the Civil War first and served his term. And 2 brothers, they were twins, served in the Civil War, Eli and Oliver. And when Ingebrigt and Helena came over on the ship in 1845, Eli and Oliver were 1-year-old twins. And so I think we mentioned how difficult that trip must have been just if you were by yourself. But if you had 6 children and 2 of them were 1-year-old, a lot of people today think, well, I can't go to Chicago with my 1-year-old infant. But sailing across the Atlantic for 2 months, that's what they did. But so those twins grew up hale and hearty, and they were farmers on the south of McFarland. And as soon as their brother signed up, Eli and Oliver signed up as well, just a few months later. And on September 19th, 1861, Oliver and Eli enlisted in the 8th Wisconsin Infantry Company E, and they enlisted for 3 years. And they also enlisted at Camp Randall in Madison. When they enlisted, Oliver said he was a farmer aged 20 years. In fact, Oliver and Eli were only 17 years when they signed up. And Oliver was unmarried, had blue eyes, light hair, and a light complexion, and his height was 5 feet 5 inches. So we have a pattern here of very short men in those days signing up for the Civil War. And so that's what Oliver's appearance looked like, and so we're guessing that Eli looked the very same as his twin brother. And for the most part, the 8th Wisconsin Infantry fought in the western battlegrounds of Missouri, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. And their regiment lost 55 men in battle and 221 men to disease. And so about 2/3 of the deaths during the Civil War were due to disease. And Eli Johnson survived the war. He was discharged early because of disability. I don't know if it was an injury due to a battle or if he was sick. But anyway, he came back home. But Oliver continued for his 3 years, and then he enlisted again on February 23rd, 1864 for a second round. and he received a payment of $402 for his re-enlistment. And he took part in battles in Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, and Tennessee. But he became sick near the end of the war in February of 1865. And he died on March 1st, 1865 at Adams Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was 21 years old. And Memphis was an occupied city, the North occupied Memphis, and it became a major medical center for the Union during the war. And wounded prisoners would come by boatload and wagon to be treated at hospitals that began to specialize during the war. And prior to the war, Memphis only had one hospital. By the end of the war, they had 15. The Union used the hotels and warehouses as hospitals to serve the wounded and the sick. And so Memphis became a hospital town with over 5,000 wounded Union troops being brought for recovery. But Eli lived for a number of years, died in 1901. But Oliver, and he's buried here, but Oliver is not buried here because he died in 1865. And this cemetery didn't exist in 1865. So Oliver, they think at first was buried in Memphis or the Memphis area, but the family had him brought back to Dunn Township, and he's buried in the Town of Dunn burying ground out on Highway B, the corner of Sand Hill Road. And there were other Civil War veterans from McFarland or the McFarland area. I think I mentioned in one of the previous walking tours the John Shedder family. He had two sons who served in the Civil War, and they both made it back home, but one was severely wounded and had a tough life after that and died at a young age. They had a son-in-law, James Crooks, who died in the Civil War because of disease, and he's buried probably down in Louisiana. The Ellisteds had a veteran who fought in the Civil War, Peter Ellisted, and after the war he came home and then moved to Iowa. And there was an Andrew Anderson who fought in the Civil War and came back. He's buried in this cemetery. And there's Ole A. Bakke, and he made it back to live in the rest of his life in the McFarland area. And there's an Ole O. Bakke who died of typhoid during the war, and he's buried at Vicksburg. So there are a number of McFarland veterans who served in the Civil War. And we're going to stay with Eli Johnson for a moment. He and his wife Martha had 12 children, and 3 of their sons, Oscar, Martin, and Andrew, fought in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And Andrew Johnson, one of their sons, was killed in action near Luzon on October 24th, 1900. And we're just going to turn around a little bit. On this side of the marker, it's Andrew Johnson, and gives the information about his death. And in the Portage Daily Democrat on December 21st, 1900, there was an article about Andrew's death. And the article says, "The engagement in which Johnson was killed was one where 100 cavalrymen were ordered out to dislodge an army of fully 1,500 Filipinos who were entrenched and protected. As an instance of the fearful odds that the company was subjected to and the deadly work of the foe, it may be mentioned that more than half of the horses were either killed or captured." And that's somewhat interesting that they mentioned the horses in their article, because Andrew is listed in the paper as being a farrier, which is a kind of a historic term for someone who took care of horses, or he was a blacksmith. And so he was probably involved in all of the horses during battle, because in 1900 there weren't any tanks or trucks or jeeps. There were horses that were pulling the wagons and pulling all the battle gear. And so the Filipinos probably knew that was a good target to go after the horses, and Andrew was probably near the horses and suffered from those wounds that he received that day, and he was killed. The article went on to say that the father, Eli Johnson, is deeply wrought up over the death of his son, as he feels that someone has committed a great military blunder in ordering such an insignificant number against a foe of such numerical strength. And so Eli, it says he was deeply wrought, and this was written December 21st, 1900. And you can see, I'll just read it for you on Eli's headstone, that he died a month later in 1901 in his 50s. So hard telling if he died from a heart attack or some sort of disease, but he's probably overcome by his son's death. That maybe shouldn't have happened, and so he died a short while later.
Ron, was the disease often cholera or TB? What did it say anything in any of the articles about what disease?
In the Civil War, the common disease was typhoid, but it could have been, any type of thing that would give you a fever in the swamps of like Louisiana or in the Philippine Islands. And before we leave the Johnson family, there was one son, Elmer, their youngest son, who was a corporal in the Marines during World War I. And so we're going to talk about World War I now, but we're going to take a walk to the other side of the cemetery. All right. Now we're on World War I, and there are at least 20 graves here of men who fought in World War I from the McFarland area. But there are two McFarland boys who died in France during the war. Elvin Edwards and Helmer Nelson, and both are buried in France. And Elvin Edwards is the son of Theodore and Mary Edwards, and he was born in 1897 and grew up in McFarland, where his father had started the hardware and farm implement business. But Elvin enlisted in the Marine Corps at the beginning of the U.S. involvement in 1917 and took part in several battles, which resulted in his promotion to colonel. But he died on October 16th, 1918, just a few weeks before the armistice. He died in France of pneumonia, but complicated by battle wounds. And I have a couple of conflicting reports how he was wounded. One report says he was shot, and another report says he was wounded in 3 places by flying shrapnel. But anyway, as he's recuperating in the hospital, he develops pneumonia, and he dies from that. And the family wasn't notified of his death until November 7th, 4 days before the armistice. And at that time, McFarland was preparing a peace celebration. But when everybody heard about Elvin Edwards' death, that celebration was canceled. And Elvin is buried in the Saint-Mihiel cemetery in France. The other veteran who was killed in France was Helmer Nelson, and he was born on October 12, 1896 in the McFarland area. His parents were Ole and Mary Nelson, who farmed east of town. His older sister was Dorothy Helmke, who some of you have probably heard of. And Helmer married Alma Aslakson of Stoughton in 1918 before he went to military training. And it was during this training all summer and early fall that he wrote home often. And his last letter to his parents was September 24th, 1918, from his camp in New York. And that's where Helmer shipped out for France on October 8th, 1918. And both Helmer and Elvin were involved in the final Allied offensive of World War I. That stretched along the entire Western Front. It was fought from September 26th until the armistice of November 11th, a total of 47 days. And the campaign was known as the Meuse-Argonne Battle. And the Meuse-Argonne offensive was the largest operation of the American forces in World War I, with over 1 million soldiers participating. It was also the deadliest campaign in American history, resulting in over 26,000 deaths, with over 120,000 casualties. So 26,277 Americans died in this final fight over a period of 6 weeks, the highest American death toll for any single battle campaign in U.S. history. And so Alvin and Elmer were two of those casualties. The family hadn't heard from Helmer since that September letter, but they heard unofficially that he had possibly been killed. And it wasn't until the following February when the family received official notice of Helmer's death, being killed on November 8th, 1918. And the letter mentioned that he had been buried in France. So there again, just a few days before the armistice, Helmer was killed. And a memorial service was held at the McFarland Lutheran Church on March 8th, 1919. And though Helmer is buried in France, the family put a memorial on his grandparents' headstone. And this is called a cenotaph, where a monument to someone buried elsewhere is erected, and usually it's for someone who was killed in a war. And in the inscription down here, it's kind of hard to see, but it says, and this is in the letter that he wrote to his parents, "It might be a long time before you hear from me again." And that's September 24th, 1918. And the letter written by Helmer to his parents went on to say, "Now don't worry about me, as I am all right and feeling fine, and I don't think the war will last much longer, and I know I will never see the firing lines." But Helmer didn't know, and I don't think most of the soldiers knew what was happening with this massive offensive in France, with over 1 million soldiers taking place. And so Helmer's buried in the McFarland's Cemetery. The cemetery contains the largest number of American military killed in Europe, 14,246, most of them losing their lives during this McFarland offensive. And the mothers of Alvin and Helmer were among the Gold Star mothers who made a U.S. government-sponsored pilgrimage to France in 1930 to visit their sons' graves. And there's another veteran of World War I just over here, and I'll walk that way. All right, the other veteran is Albert Anderson, who is buried here. And he was born in 1889 to Peter and Anna Anderson, and he grew up in the McFarland area. And he joined the military and was part of the 58th Infantry Company I. And that 58th Infantry got off to a rocky start. The first casualties for the 58th Infantry occurred when the troop ship RMS Moldavia, coming from England to France, carrying some of the 58th Regiment, was torpedoed and sunk on May 23rd, 1918, and there were 56 casualties. I don't know if Albert was on that ship and was one of the survivors, or if he came on a different troop ship, but that was not a great start to the 58th Infantry. And when the infantry arrived in France, they served fighting in Soissons and the Rheims on the Western Front. But for Albert, it was not all quiet on the Western Front. He was wounded and gassed during the battles in France, and saw terrible action. But he made it home and after the war, and lived in the Stoughton area. But for 3 years he lived with the horrors of war, dealing with the trauma as best he could. But then on the evening of February 25th, 1921, he couldn't take it any longer. So Albert laid his neck on the railroad tracks between McFarland and Stoughton as passenger train number 14 coming from the north around 7:30 at night, and he was found a little while later with his body off on the side of the tracks, but showing no scars or injuries, but his head was found between the rails. a large number of American Legion, Gold Stripes, and other ex-soldiers and sailors from the area turned out for Albert's funeral at the McFarland Lutheran Church, all in full uniform. And a newspaper article at the time stated that Albert was well liked by everyone who knew him. Though he died 3 years after the war and he wasn't on the battlefield, I still consider Albert a casualty of World War I. So now we'll move on to World War II, and we'll take a little hike back this way. All right, now we're in World War II, and we're next to the headstone for Wesley Summers, who was born April 7th, 1922 in Cottage Grove, but he and his family were members of the McFarland Lutheran Church. So Wesley grew up in Cottage Grove and attended school there through the 10th grade, but like McFarland, Cottage Grove didn't have a high school, so he went to Madison to finish out his schooling and graduated from Madison East before attending the University of Wisconsin. But it was right when World War II was happening, so Wesley enlisted in the Army Air Corps as a flying cadet in October 1942. And he received his wings in April 1944 as a second lieutenant, and was assigned to the 493rd Bombardment Squadron, 7th Bombardment Group, based in Pandaswar, India. And he was a pilot of the B-24M Liberator bomber. He had a number of missions over Burma, where he would be assigned to drop bombs on Japanese targets. And he had a crew with 8 members on his bomber. And on June 28, 1945, they took off for his 26th bombing mission that targeted the Japanese holdings near Ban Takli, Siam. And while returning to base, flying over Burma, the plane was contacted by radio, and the pilot responded asking about weather conditions near Pandaswar, India. And 5 minutes later, the radio operator called back but was unable to contact the Liberator, and the plane never returned to base. Search missions covered the flight area that the aircraft traveled, but no trace of the plane or the crew was ever found. It is believed that the plane crashed due to poor weather into the Bay of Bengal. And so Summers and the rest of the crew, they were listed as missing in action for a year, and he was declared dead by the military in July 1946. On May 25th, 1947, the Summers family had a memorial service for Wesley at the McFarland Lutheran Church and had this marker installed in the cemetery. And Second Lieutenant Summers is also memorialized on the wall of the missing at Manila American Cemetery in the Philippines. And so Wesley Summers, some of you may have known the story, but this was new to me this summer when I stumbled across his story, and I found it quite amazing that for someone who served in World War II and was a member of the Church of McFarland, very little has been written or said about him. But there were a couple other men from the McFarland area who died as a result of World War II. Stephen Foy entered service in September 1943 and went overseas in December. He was a private first class serving with the Marines in the Pacific on the Palau Islands. But that's where he was killed in action. And he was married to a woman from Stoughton, and they had a 17-month-old child. And his father was living in Edwards Park during the war, and I think that's where Stephen Foy spent a lot of his time as a child. And then there's Henry Kampmeyer, who entered the service in March 1945 and went overseas in August after VJ Day, and he was serving as a military police detachment in the Philippines. And while there, Kampmeyer was stricken with polio and was in the hospital receiving treatment, but it wasn't enough, and he died from polio in the hospital. and he's buried in the Holy Cross Cemetery in Madison. And Kampmeyer was born in Blooming Grove. And now we'll go on to the Korean War, and we'll take a hike over in that direction. Okay, and before I get to Daryl Krenz and the Korean War, I just wanted to mention, go back to World War II for a minute. And there are at least 50 veterans from World War II buried in the two cemeteries in McFarland, and they all have amazing stories, I'm sure. And just the veterans from McFarland as a whole who served in World War II, even if they're not buried here, they're just amazing, incredible stories that they were the adults in town when I was growing up. And you'd never think of these people as having these amazing experiences, but they did, and then they came back and they went on with their lives and did their business or taught or whatever their occupation was. And one man who's not buried here, but just an example of this, is Roger Edwards, and who had the hardware store. And what he did in World War II was amazing, and I wish I would have printed off that article so I could read it. But he was a pilot as well, I believe, and in Europe. And just if you have a chance to look up Roger Edwards on like newspapers.com during the 1940s and find out what he did, it's just amazing that then he'd come back and sell nails or hammer to people, and it was just life as usual for all these people. But
And they never talked about the war experiences.
no,
They didn't want to talk about it.
no, they never did talk about it, and they didn't, think they had a badge on their sleeve to make them more important than the other people. They didn't. They just did their duty, and they went on with their lives, and pretty amazing. But now we're at the Korean War, and I'm sure a number of you knew Daryl Krenz, or knew of him. But if you don't know his story, after today, if you could go home and on the internet just look up Daryl Krenz, and there's a wonderful interview with him. I think the group Fishing with Veterans, and Daryl tells a story which is pretty amazing. I don't think I can even come close to describing what he went through, but I'll try in a couple minutes to say what Daryl did. But he was born on July 28, 1931 in Columbus, Wisconsin. But he grew up in the McFarland area and graduated from the 10th grade in McFarland. And again, McFarland didn't have a high school, so he had to go to Madison East. But he didn't have the family support that could drive him up there or anyone to get him to school, so he had to ride his bike to Madison East from here. And he said it in his interview that he was absent most of the time, because if the weather was bad, he wasn't going to ride his bike to Madison East. And so at age 16, he tried to enlist in the Marines, but the Marines found out his age and they wouldn't take him. Excuse me. And so he waited a year, and next year at age 17, he enlisted in the Army in 1948, and they took him. And so there he was training to be in the Army for about 14 months, and then after that training, they sent him to Japan as a part of the post-war occupation forces. And when he was stationed in Japan in June 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South Korea, and so the United States joined the battle 2 days later, and the American troops in Japan were the closest, so they were the first ones sent over to Korea. And so Daryl was in that group, and he said they didn't know where they were going, but they soon found out that they were in Korea, and they were loaded on a train heading north and were told to prepare for combat. And on July 4th, 1950, Krenz and his company had their first taste of combat, one of the first American fighting groups in the war. And according to Krenz, within days they were overwhelmed by the North Koreans and captured. 39 soldiers were in Krenz's platoon, and by July 20th there were only 3 left. And so he was put with prisoners from other platoons, and all total there were around 800 prisoners. And so he was one of the first prisoners of war in Korea, and as they were captured and put into these holding pens, their boots were taken away, and their jackets were taken away, and they were kept in a hut. They had very little to eat, and they drank dirty water. But eventually the UN forces started moving north, and so the North Koreans then moved the prisoners further north, and so they went on this march for about 400 miles. And they marched day and night in frigid conditions, no boots, no jackets, or very little food. And Krenz said they marched for about 9 days with these 800 prisoners to the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and China. And the march was called the Tiger Death March because there was a North Korean major who the prisoners of war nicknamed the Tiger, and he would indiscriminately shoot a prisoner just for no reason. And a high number of prisoners were just shot by this man. And of those 800 prisoners who were initially captured, 278 eventually came home. They spent the first winter in an old school building with inadequate food and cold conditions. And one day, Dale said he was starving, so he saw this hut on the other side of a fence that he thought might have some food. So he climbed over the fence and went into the hut and found some peppers. And on his way back, he was face to face with a North Korean guard, who then took him to a separate area and just beat him over and over again. And then they moved him to another place, and once again they just kept beating him severely. And so then after they were done beating him, they took him outside and they threw him on a death pile, what they called. It was just a mound of decaying corpses of fellow prisoners. But Daryl came to, and it was in the middle of the winter. It was just freezing cold, but somehow he was able to regain consciousness and crawl off that pile of bodies and crawl back to the hut where the other prisoners were. And he gained some strength back from that, but then the POWs were moved to China, where they were kept in a camp for another 12 months. The food was a little bit better, he said, but the Chinese were forcing the POWs to hear and learn communist propaganda every day. But on August 26, 1953, all the prisoners were loaded onto trucks, and they were heading south. And then Daryl says that he looked out the truck and he could see American flags, and he was trying to figure out what had happened. And so he jumped off the truck. I think he said he fell off the truck because he was so weak. But then he made his way over to the one of the flagpoles and just hugged it. And then a lieutenant came over to him and said, "Son, someday you will have all the flags you want." And Daryl is the one who started the flag memorial behind the Legion Hall on Burma Road. So that's the reason why there's so many flags. He was released in August 1953 when he was 22. When he was taken prisoner, he was still 18, just a few days before he turned 19. So from 18 to 22, he was in a prisoner of war camp. Amazing that he got out alive. He said when he was a prisoner, he dreamed a lot about home. But then when he got home, he dreamed a lot about over there. He couldn't get it out of his head. There was another POW from McFarland, but isn't buried here, Gerald or Jerry Siebert. He was a prisoner of war for 33 months, and he was captured in November 1950, and he was released in August 1953 as well. And Krenz and Siebert were honored by the McFarland community at the Edwards Park Pavilion on September 23rd, 1953, with over 500 people attending. But again, if you have a chance, listen to Daryl's interview with Fishing with Veterans. It's quite an amazing story. And now we just have a short walk over to Dennis Chamberlain, right over here. So now we're on the Vietnam War, and we're at the gravesite of Dennis Chamberlain, who was born July 14th, 1949 in Madison. While he was young, his parents divorced, and his mother, Esther, remarried Carol Johnson, a McFarland farmer. And Dennis grew up on the Johnson farm, attending McFarland schools. And the Johnson farm is on Johnson Street, just past the grade school. The old farmhouse is still there, and you might know of the silo with the house on top. That was part of the Johnson farm. But his mother, Esther, divorced Carol Johnson around 1965, at which time she and Dennis moved to Elkhorn, Wisconsin, and that's where he continued in high school and graduated in 1967. But shortly after that, Dennis was drafted into the Army to serve in Vietnam, and he was part of the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Division, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, 11th Aviation Group, B Company, and he was a Specialist 4. His specialist was aircraft maintenance, especially the helicopters, but he was also a helicopter gunner that you will see in a lot of the movies on Vietnam, with the big side door with a machine gun there. He was based in Tay Ninh, northwest of Saigon, but not too far from the Cambodian border. And in April 1970, that base was used as a staging area for the U.S. units participating in the Cambodian campaign. And so because of that, that base was targeted on numerous times by the Viet Cong, shooting in rockets or mortar shells. And on June 26, 1970, one such attack occurred with mortar and rocket fire, and that's what killed Dennis at his base. There were full military funeral services in Elkhorn, and the burial was here in McFarland. And Dennis received the Silver Star, Bronze Star, Air Medal, and the Purple Heart. But in 1976, Carol Johnson, his stepfather, sold the farm to developers, and it was the development was being laid out, the streets and whatnot, and part of the agreement with the developers, Carol Johnson insisted that one of the streets be named Dennis Drive, after Dennis Chamberlain. And now our final story will be over in the far corner with Afghanistan, Joshua Brennan. All right. Now here we have Joshua Brennan. He was born in 1985 in El Paso, Texas. But he spent a lot of his time in the state of Oregon and also here in McFarland. His parents were divorced, and so Joshua spent the school years in Oregon, the state of Oregon, with his mother. But during the summer times, he'd come to McFarland and be with his father. So he developed a lot of good friends in the McFarland area during his summers here. But he also went to school here between the ages of 8 and 10. So he graduated from Ontario, Oregon High School, and soon afterward enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving as a paratrooper with the 173rd Airborne Infantry Brigade. He served a full tour, earning the Bronze Star for Valor and a Purple Heart. His tour was supposed to end in 2007, but it was extended for another year by the U.S. Army in what they call a stop-loss order. And during the second month of his extended duty in August 2007, Brennan was shot in the leg. But within days of his injury, Brennan was insistent on being out with his men and soon returned to duty. And they were mostly involved in the Korengal Valley, which is nicknamed the Valley of Death. It's just thick brush, forests, steep mountainsides, and there was constant fighting, daily fighting. And it's on the border with Pakistan. So kind of like just a no man's land. It was just a terrible place where the bullets were flying practically every day. And the fighting was fierce and constant, and his unit members had been shot at on all but 3 days for the next 2 months. And one day in late October, Brennan's platoon had waited until dark before heading out, single file, and Brennan was in the lead as usual, but not 300 yards in, they fell into an ambush, and the Taliban fighters were waiting for them. Brennan was hit instantly, being wounded in the chest and the jaw, and the Taliban fighters tried to drag off his body, but a medic, Hugo Mendoza, hurled 6 grenades at the Taliban before he himself was killed. And then specialist Salvador Juenta then ran towards the fighters who were dragging Brennan. And under heavy fire, he emptied his M4 rifle at the enemy and managed to pull Josh Brennan to safety. Juenta described the scene as such: "There were more bullets in the air than stars in the sky. A wall of bullets at everyone at the same time, with one crack and then a million other cracks afterwards. They're above you, in front of you, behind you, below you. They're hitting in the dirt early. They're going over your head, just all over the place. They were close as I've ever seen." Josh had been severely wounded by a rocket-propelled grenade and small arms fire. And though he was stabilized and medevaced out of the Korengal Valley, he died several hours later, 5 months into his second tour of duty. He had earned 3 Bronze Stars, including 1 for valor and 2 Purple Hearts. And for his heroism and bravery, Juenta earned the military's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, becoming the first living soldier to receive such an honor since the Vietnam War. And if you haven't heard Josh's story, you could go on to the internet again and search for a 60-minute segment about this ambush that Josh Brennan was shot in, but it was about this Juenta who was the recipient of the Medal of Honor, and they told the story about that platoon and the fight that they were under. And Juenta was from Clinton, Iowa, and one of Josh's best friends. But that brings us to the end of the tour, except there's just a couple of things, as I mentioned, about the heroism and the sacrifice and the courage. These are pretty amazing stories, but there's one common thread which is very, very sad. Oliver Johnson in the Civil War, age 21. Andrew Johnson in the Spanish-American War, age 20. Helmer Nelson, World War I, age 22. Elvin Edwards, age 21. Wesley Summers, World War II, age 24. Stephen Fry, World War II, age 22. Dennis Chamberlain, Vietnam, age 20. And Joshua Brennan, Afghanistan, age 22. These were all very, very young men. So, hard to wrap that one up. I don't know what else to say, but thank you to these men. And thank you for coming.